Nobody sat with her. At the harvest feast, then a stranger said, "Pretend you're mine tonight." The autumn of 1823 arrived in Riverside with a peculiar cruelty, painting the Missouri frontier town in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to mock Beatrice Thornton's gray existence. She stood before the cracked mirror in her small room above the general store, adjusting the worn collar of her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days, much like herself. 24 years old and already relegated to the margins of life, Beatrice's reflection told a story she knew too well. Round face, plump arms, a body that defied the fashionable silhouettes admired in the settlement. Her mother had stopped making new dresses for her 2 years ago, declaring it a waste of good fabric. Her father pretended she didn't exist in public, walking several paces ahead when circumstances forced them onto the same street. The harvest feast represented the social pinnacle of Riverside's calendar, a night when the entire settlement gathered to celebrate another year of survival on the unforgiving frontier. Farmers displayed their bounty, trappers their furs, and eligible young women their charms. It was a night of dancing, courtship, and community. For Beatrice, it was an annual exercise in humiliation, yet something stubborn in her soul refused to stay home. She descended the narrow stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty store. Her employer, Mrs. Garrison, had already left for the festivities with her family, not thinking to invite the help. Beatrice wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the crisp evening air. The community hall blazed with lantern light, music and laughter spilling through its open doors like a river she could never quite reach. Beatrice paused at the threshold, gathering courage from some deep hidden well within herself. She stepped inside. The transformation was immediate and familiar. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they shifted, eyes sliding toward her, then quickly away, as if looking too long might somehow contaminate the observer. Young women in their fashionable dresses clustered together, whispering behind gloved hands. Men focused intently on their drinks or companions, suddenly fascinated by anything that wasn't Beatrice Thornton entering the room. She made her way to a table in the far corner, partially hidden by a support beam, her usual spot, claimed through 3 years of attending alone. The table could seat 6, but it remained empty except for her, an island of isolation in a sea of community. Platters of roasted venison, wild turkey, cornbread, and autumn vegetables covered the long serving tables. The harvest had been generous this year, and the town celebrated accordingly. Beatrice filled her plate mechanically, barely seeing the food, and returned to her solitary post. As she ate, she watched the gathering with the careful attention of an outsider. Sarah Pritchard flirted openly with Thomas Blackwood, their courtship progressing as predictably as the seasons. The Reverend Morrison blessed the meal with his usual lengthy prayer, which everyone endured patiently. Children darted between tables, their laughter genuine and uncomplicated. Then the door opened again, and a different kind of silence fell. Joshua Crawford stood in the doorway like an apparition from another world, which in many ways he was. Tall and lean, with dark hair that brushed his shoulders and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness, he wore buckskin clothing that marked him immediately as a mountain man. A Hudson's Bay Company trapper, most likely, come down from the high country to trade his furs before winter sealed the passes. He carried himself with the unconscious confidence of a man who had faced down grizzly bears and survived Rocky Mountain winters. His eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue, swept the room with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading landscapes for danger and opportunity. Mayor Hutchinson approached him immediately, ever the politician. "Welcome, friend. Joshua Crawford, isn't it? Heard you brought down a fine load of beaver pelts. The trading post boys said they're prime quality." "Word travels fast," Joshua replied, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone who spent more time talking to mountains than men. Hoped I might find a meal and perhaps some company this evening. Been 3 months since I've seen this many people in one place. Of course, of course. Help yourself to the feast. Plenty of room. The mayor gestured broadly at the crowded hall, but his eyes skipped over Beatrice's table without pause, as if the empty chairs beside her simply didn't exist. Joshua noticed. His gaze tracked the mayor's gesture, then continued past the crowded tables to land on the solitary figure in the corner. For a long moment, he simply looked at Beatrice, his expression unreadable. She felt his attention like a physical touch and immediately looked down at her plate, her heart hammering. Please don't come over here out of pity, she thought desperately. Please just ignore me like everyone else. But Joshua Crawford had spent too many years in the honest wilderness to develop the convenient blindness of civilized society. He filled a plate at the serving tables, accepted a mug of ale, and walked directly to Beatrice's table. Mind if I sit here, ma'am? His voice was polite, almost gentle. Beatrice looked up, startled, expecting to see mockery or drunkenness, some explanation for this departure from social norms. But his eyes were clear and his expression open, holding nothing but simple courtesy. The other tables, she stammered, gesturing vaguely toward the crowded room, are full of gossip and small talk, he finished. I've had my fill of noise these past few days. This seems like the most peaceful spot in the place. He smiled, and something about it seemed genuine. Unless you prefer dining alone, I'll respect that if so. It was the question that decided her. He was giving her a choice, treating her like a person whose preferences mattered. No, she said quietly. Please, sit. He settled into the chair across from her with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. For several minutes they ate in silence, but it wasn't the awkward quiet Beatrice had expected. Joshua seemed genuinely content, enjoying his food with the appreciation of a man who had eaten too many meals of jerked meat and hardtack. I'm Joshua, he said eventually, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand in a gesture that would have horrified Riverside's ladies, but somehow seemed perfectly natural from him. Beatrice, she replied softly. Beatrice Thornton. Well, Miss Thornton, Mrs., she corrected automatically, then froze, horrified at the lie that had slipped out unbidden, but Joshua's eyebrows merely rose slightly. My apologies, Mrs. Thornton. Your husband not joining us this evening. She could have corrected herself then, explained it was a mistake, but something reckless stirred in her chest, the same stubbornness that brought her to these feasts year after year. He's away on business, she heard herself say. Ah, Joshua nodded, accepting this without question. Difficult thing, being separated. I imagine these gatherings are harder without him beside you. Guilt twisted in Beatrice's stomach, but before she could confess her deception, Mayor Hutchinson's voice boomed across the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, now that we've filled our bellies, it's time for the traditional harvest waltz. All married couples, please join us on the dance floor. Chairs scraped against floorboards as couples rose throughout the hall. Sarah Pritchard and Thomas Blackwood stood together. They'd announced their engagement just last week. The Morrisons, the Hutchinsons, the Blackwoods, the Garrisons, all the respectable married couples of Riverside made their way to the cleared space that served as a dance floor. Beatrice's brief moment of recklessness crumbled into shame. She stared fixedly at her plate, unable to look at Joshua, unable to watch the couples assembling for the dance. The lie hung between them like a physical thing. But Joshua wasn't looking at the dance floor. He was watching Beatrice's face, seeing things he recognized from his own experience. The careful mask of indifference worn over deep loneliness, the determined dignity in the face of casual cruelty. He made a decision. Mrs. Thornton, he said quietly, leaning forward slightly. This might sound strange, but I have a rather unusual favor to ask of you. She looked up, surprised by his serious tone. Would you be willing to pretend to be my wife tonight? The words came out in a rush, as if he needed to speak them before courage failed. Just for this evening, just for the dance? Beatrice stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. What? Joshua glanced toward the dance floor, then back to her, his expression earnest. See that woman there? The one in the red dress with the dark hair? Beatrice followed his gaze to Constance Whitmore, a widow of 35 with a reputation for aggressive husband hunting. She stood near the dance floor, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Mrs. Whitmore has made her intentions toward me quite clear over the past 3 days, Joshua continued, his voice low and urgent. She's determined to secure a husband before winter, and apparently I'm her chosen target. She's been relentless, cornering me at the trading post, appearing wherever I happen to be, making her interest abundantly clear to anyone who'll listen. He ran a hand through his hair, genuinely distressed. If she thinks I'm married, perhaps she'll finally leave me be. It was plausible enough. Constance was indeed known for her aggressive courtship tactics, but something in Joshua's eyes made Beatrice wonder if there wasn't more to the story. Still, the chance to dance, to be part of the celebration rather than merely its observer, called to something deep within her. Why me? She asked. You could ask anyone. Because you're the only person here who hasn't tried to sell me something, set me up with their daughter, or pump me for gossip about my travels, Joshua said simply. And because... He hesitated, then continued with apparent honesty. You seem kind. I'd rather share this deception with someone kind than someone calculating. Beatrice's throat tightened. Kindness. Such a small thing, yet no one had attributed it to her in longer than she could remember, as if kindness were incompatible with her appearance. If you refuse, I understand completely, Joshua added quickly. It's an imposition, asking you to participate in my problems. But I confess, I'm desperate enough to ask. The fiddles were tuning up. Mayor Hutchinson was calling for the couples to take their positions. Beatrice looked at Joshua's outstretched hand, scarred from wilderness living, calloused from hard work, but steady and real. She took it. Yes, she said, her voice barely audible. I'll help you. The relief that flooded Joshua's face seemed almost excessive for the situation, but he stood quickly, drawing her up with him. Thank you, he said fervently. Truly, thank you. They walked toward the dance floor, and Beatrice felt the weight of every eye in the room upon them. Whispers erupted like wildfire. She heard fragments. That's Joshua Crawford, with Beatrice Thornton, actually dancing. Can't possibly... Constance Whitmore's face transformed from predatory interest to shocked outrage. She stepped forward as if to intercept them, but Joshua smoothly positioned himself and Beatrice among the other couples, effectively blocking her approach. The fiddles struck up the familiar melody of the Rose of Alabama, adapted for waltz time. Joshua's right hand settled on Beatrice's waist, his left hand clasping her right. She placed her free hand on his shoulder, trembling so hard she feared her legs might give way entirely. Look at me, Joshua murmured as the dance began. Not at them, just at me. She raised her eyes to his, finding an unexpected steadiness there. He led her into the dance with surprising grace for a mountain man, his steps sure and confident. Beatrice had learned the basic dances years ago, practicing alone in her room to music that existed only in her imagination. Now, with a real partner, real music, real eyes watching, she struggled to remember the patterns. Breathe, Joshua instructed softly. Just follow my lead. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. That's it. They moved around the floor, and gradually Beatrice's panic subsided into something almost like pleasure. Joshua was a skilled dancer, another surprise about this enigmatic stranger. He guided her through the turns with gentle pressure, compensating smoothly when she stumbled, never making her feel inadequate or clumsy. You're doing beautifully, he said, his voice pitched only for her. A natural dancer, Mrs. Thornton. Despite everything, Beatrice felt a smile tug at her lips. "You're very kind, Mr. Crawford." "Joshua," he corrected. "If we're to be married even in pretense, you should call me Joshua, and I'll call you Beatrice if you'll permit it." "I suppose that would be appropriate," she agreed, feeling strangely giddy. "For our pretend marriage." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Indeed, we must be convincing." As the dance continued, Beatrice became gradually aware of changes in the atmosphere around them. The whispers had subsided into thoughtful silence. People were watching, yes, but with something other than mockery. Curiosity, perhaps, or reassessment. Sarah Pritchard actually smiled at her as they passed. Even Mayor Hutchinson nodded approvingly, as if a mountain man claiming Beatrice as his wife somehow elevated her in his estimation. The dance ended too soon. The couple separated, applauding the musicians, and Beatrice felt the magical bubble of the moment preparing to burst. She started to step away to return to her corner table and her proper role as observer, but Joshua kept his hand on hers. "The evening's not over yet, wife," he said with a slight smile. "Let's give them a show worth remembering." They returned to their table, but everything had changed. People who had ignored Beatrice all evening now nodded greetings as they passed. Thomas Blackwood actually stopped to compliment Joshua on his lovely wife, though his eyes held confusion. Everyone in Riverside knew Beatrice wasn't married. Constance Whitmore materialized beside their table like a vengeful spirit, her red dress a slash of color against the rustic wood. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced to your companion." "My wife," Joshua said firmly, standing with old-fashioned courtesy that somehow didn't seem out of place on him. "Beatrice, may I present Mrs. Constance Whitmore? Mrs. Whitmore, my wife, Beatrice Crawford." The false name struck Beatrice like a physical blow. She opened her mouth, uncertain whether to maintain the deception or confess everything. But Constance spoke first. "How extraordinary," the widow said, her smile sharp as a skinning knife. "I wasn't aware you were married, Mr. Crawford. You certainly didn't mention a wife when we spoke at the trading post yesterday. In fact, you specifically said you were an unattached man seeking to establish yourself before winter." Joshua's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I said I was seeking to establish a winter camp," he corrected carefully, "for myself and my wife. Perhaps you misheard." "Perhaps," Constance agreed, her tone making clear she believed no such thing. Her eyes moved to Beatrice with calculated cruelty. "Though I must say, you're not at all what I would have expected for Joshua Crawford's wife. He strikes me as a man who values—" She paused delicately. "Different qualities in a woman." The barb hit its target perfectly. Beatrice felt heat flood her face, shame and anger warring in her chest. She had been a fool to believe, even for a moment, that she could play this role. Of course, no one would believe a man like Joshua would choose a woman like her. But before she could flee, Joshua's hand covered hers on the table, his grip gentle but firm. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge Beatrice hadn't heard before, the steel beneath the courtesy, the danger that came from surviving in the wilderness. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "you're absolutely right. I do value different qualities than most men. I value kindness over cruelty, genuine warmth over calculated charm, and honest companionship over aggressive pursuit. My wife possesses all of these in abundance, which is precisely why I married her and not someone else." He stood, still holding Beatrice's hand. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe they're starting another dance." He led Beatrice away, leaving Constance sputtering behind them. But instead of heading to the dance floor, Joshua guided her toward the door, out into the cool night air. The autumn sky stretched overhead, brilliant with stars impossible to see in the lantern light inside. Joshua walked a short distance from the hall before releasing Beatrice's hand and turning to face her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have put you in that position. Constance can be vindictive. It doesn't matter, Beatrice said dully. She's right, isn't it? No one believes you'd actually marry someone like me. This whole pretense is ridiculous. Someone like you, Joshua's voice sharpened. What does that mean? You know what it means. Beatrice wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. I'm fat, Joshua. Unmarried at 24 because no man wants a wife who looks like me. My own family is ashamed to be seen with me in public. I work in a general store because no one will hire me where customers might see me. I'm invisible unless I'm being mocked, and tonight I let myself believe. She broke off, furious at the tears threatening to fall. Joshua was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. Beatrice, I need to tell you something. I lied to you tonight. She looked up, startled. Constance Whitmore isn't trying to trap me into marriage, he continued, meeting her eyes directly. Oh, she's been friendly enough, and perhaps she does have her sights set on finding a husband, but she's hardly been relentless in pursuing me. I exaggerated significantly. Beatrice stared at him, confusion warring with hurt. Then why? Because I walked into that hall tonight, saw you sitting alone while everyone else celebrated together, and I couldn't stand it. Joshua's hands clenched at his sides. I saw how people looked past you, through you, as if you weren't there. I saw your face, the way you were trying so hard to appear unbothered while clearly being wounded, and I thought, no one should have to be invisible like that. So you took pity on me, Beatrice said bitterly. That's worse, Joshua. I'd rather be ignored than be someone's charity case. It wasn't pity, Joshua insisted. It was recognition. He took a step closer, his expression intense. Do you know what it's like to spend months alone in the mountains? To go weeks without hearing another human voice? I chose that life. I prefer it, actually. But there's a difference between choosing solitude and having it forced upon you. Between wanting to be alone and being made to feel you have no right to connection. He ran a hand through his hair, struggling for words. When I saw you tonight, I saw someone who should be part of the celebration, but was being excluded from it. Someone who deserved better than she was getting. And I thought, just this once, just for tonight, maybe I could help change that. Not out of pity, but because it seemed like the decent thing to do. By lying to me? Beatrice asked, but some of the hurt had left her voice. Yes, Joshua admitted, and I apologize for that. I should have been honest from the start, but I thought if I told you the truth, you'd refuse out of pride or fear, or simply not believing that someone might want to sit with you for your own sake. He held her gaze steadily. Was I wrong? Beatrice wanted to say yes, to claim she would have accepted his honesty, but she knew herself too well. No, she admitted quietly. I would have assumed you were mocking me. Exactly. Joshua's shoulders relaxed slightly. So I created a story that gave us both an excuse to share a table, a dance, an evening of something other than loneliness. Was it manipulative? Yes. Do I regret it? He paused, considering. No, because for a few hours you smiled, you danced. You existed in that room as a full person rather than a shadow. That seems worth a small deception. The tears Beatrice had been fighting finally escaped, trailing warm down her cool cheeks. Why do you care? You don't even know me. I know enough, Joshua said softly. I know you came to that feast alone. Year after year, I'd wager, refusing to let their judgment keep you hidden away. That takes courage most people never develop. I know you agreed to help a stranger with a ridiculous request, even though it put you in an uncomfortable position. That's kindness. And I know that when we danced, you followed my lead with grace and trust, despite having every reason to doubt my intentions. That's strength. He smiled slightly. Those are qualities I recognize because I see them in the wilderness every day. The courage to face harsh conditions, the kindness that shares resources in times of scarcity, the strength to survive when survival isn't guaranteed. You have those qualities, Beatrice. They matter more than what you look like or what Riverside's small-minded residents think of you. Beatrice wiped her eyes, trying to process everything he'd said. You're a strange man, Joshua Crawford. I've been called worse, he agreed with a small laugh. Look, I understand if you want nothing more to do with me. I overstepped, lied, and dragged you into my schemes. But if you're willing, he hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Would you like to continue our pretend marriage for the rest of the evening? Not to fool anyone or avoid anyone, but simply because I'm enjoying your company and I hope, you're enjoying mine. It was madness. By tomorrow, all of Riverside would be discussing Joshua Crawford's mysterious wife. The deception would unravel quickly, probably ending in further embarrassment for Beatrice. But standing under the stars, looking at this strange, honest man who had seen her when others looked away, Beatrice found she didn't care about tomorrow. Yes, she said, I'd like that. Joshua's answering smile transformed his face, erasing years of wilderness hardship. He offered his arm. Then shall we return to our celebration, Mrs. Crawford? Beatrice took his arm, feeling lighter than she had in years. We shall, Mr. Crawford. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of unexpected joy. Joshua proved himself an attentive husband, fetching her drinks, engaging her in genuine conversation, and generally treating her like someone whose company he valued. When the dancing resumed, he claimed her for another waltz, then a reel that left them both breathless and laughing. The citizens of Riverside watched with varying degrees of confusion, curiosity, and, in Constance Whitmore's case, barely suppressed fury. Sarah Pritchard approached during a lull between dances, her pretty face creased with puzzlement. Beatrice, she said hesitantly, I don't mean to be rude, but when did you marry? No one mentioned a wedding, and last week you were still at the general store and... She trailed off, clearly struggling between social propriety and burning curiosity. Before Beatrice could attempt an answer, Joshua intervened smoothly. We married just 3 weeks ago, miss. Forgive me, I don't believe we've been introduced. Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah corrected, displaying her new wedding ring with barely contained pride. As of last week. But 3 weeks? That's quite sudden. When you know, Joshua said, slipping his arm around Beatrice's waist in a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. I encountered Beatrice during my spring trapping season. She was walking near Widow Creek, and I'd never seen anyone look so perfectly at home in the wilderness. We talked for hours. By the time the sun set, I knew I'd found something rarer than any beaver pelt, someone who understood both solitude and connection. The story flowed from him with such smooth conviction that even Beatrice almost believed it. Sarah's skepticism visibly wavered, her romantic nature warming to the tale. How lovely, she said, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. And you've been living? In the high country, Joshua supplied. I have a cabin near the Snake River, remote but beautiful. Beatrice took to mountain life like she was born to it. This, at least, was pure fantasy. Beatrice had never been more than 5 miles from Riverside in her entire life, but Sarah nodded, apparently satisfied, and drifted away to share this fascinating news with the other wives. You're very good at lying, Beatrice murmured once they were alone again. Years of trading with different tribes, Joshua admitted. You learn to tell people what they need to hear to feel comfortable. It's not always dishonest. Sometimes it's just strategically true. Is anything you've told me tonight strategically true? Beatrice asked, not accusingly but genuinely curious. Joshua considered this seriously. The part about finding you courageous and kind? Completely true. The part about enjoying your company? Also true. The part about being married to you? He paused, his expression unreadable. Well, that's demonstrably false. But the part about wishing circumstances were different, that might be more strategically true than either of us expected. Before Beatrice could unpack that statement, Mayor Hutchinson's voice boomed across the hall. One final announcement, folks. As you know, the Autumn Trading Fair opens tomorrow and runs through the week. We're expecting trappers, traders, and travelers from all over the territory. Let's show them Riverside hospitality. The announcement triggered a wave of excited chatter. The Autumn Trading Fair was Riverside's other major social event, drawing outsiders who brought news, goods, and entertainment to the frontier settlement. Beatrice usually worked extended hours at the general store during the fair, serving customers while never quite being part of the festivities. As the crowd began to disperse, heading home to prepare for tomorrow's excitement, Joshua walked Beatrice back to the general store. They moved slowly through the darkened streets, neither eager to end the evening. "What happens tomorrow?" Beatrice asked as they reached her door. "When people realize we're not actually married?" Joshua was silent for a moment, his face shadowed. "I'll be leaving Riverside in a week," he said finally, "heading back to the mountains before the passes close. In the grand scheme of things, what Riverside thinks of me matters very little." He met her eyes. "But I've complicated things for you, haven't I? People will ask questions. They'll want explanations." "Let them ask," Beatrice said, surprising herself with the defiance in her voice. "For one evening, I was part of the celebration instead of watching from the shadows. For a few hours, I felt like I mattered. That's worth whatever consequences come tomorrow." Joshua reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with unexpected tenderness. "You've always mattered, Beatrice. Riverside's failure to see that is their loss, not your deficiency." Then he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture both chaste and intimate that left Beatrice's heart racing. "Good night, Mrs. Crawford," he murmured. "Good night, Mr. Crawford," she whispered back. She watched him disappear into the darkness, then climbed the stairs to her room, her mind whirling. Tomorrow would bring questions, certainly, judgment, probably. But tonight she had danced, laughed, and been seen. For now, that was enough. Morning arrived with the chaotic energy of the trading fair. Beatrice woke to the sounds of wagons rolling through town, traders shouting their wares, and the general hubbub of Riverside transforming from quiet settlement to bustling marketplace. Mrs. Garrison was already in the store when Beatrice descended, her face alight with barely contained gossip. "Beatrice, I heard the most extraordinary news last night. They say Joshua Crawford claimed you as his wife. Is it true? When did this happen? Why didn't you tell me?" Beatrice had prepared several possible responses during her sleepless night, but standing before her employer's eager face, all her practiced explanations deserted her. "It's complicated, Mrs. Garrison." "Complicated how? You're either married or you're not." Mrs. Garrison's eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Unless there's something irregular about it, a secret wedding, one of those mountain ceremonies." The door chimed, admitting Sarah Pritchard and two other young wives, their faces bright with curiosity. The morning proceeded in a similar fashion, with virtually every customer finding some excuse to question Beatrice about her mysterious husband. She deflected, evaded, and occasionally outright refused to answer, which only intensified the speculation. By noon, Riverside had developed several competing theories. Beatrice and Joshua had married in secret months ago. They weren't actually married but were engaged. Joshua had mistaken Beatrice for someone else and realized his error too late to correct it publicly. Or, most dramatically, Beatrice had bewitched the mountain man with some form of frontier magic. Beatrice heard these theories with a mixture of exhaustion and dark amusement. The truth, she reflected, was somehow both simpler and more complicated than any of their speculation. She didn't see Joshua all morning, which didn't surprise her. He was likely at the trading post, negotiating the sale of his furs. She told herself it was better this way, that a clean break would cause less pain than drawing out the inevitable. Yet some foolish part of her kept hoping he would appear at the store, smile at her across the counter, and make last night feel real again. Afternoon brought a different kind of crisis. Beatrice was rearranging the fabric displays when the door chimed and her mother entered, her face set in lines of grim determination. "Beatrice Marie Thornton," Eleanor Thornton said, her voice carrying the particular blend of anger and embarrassment that Beatrice knew too well. "We need to speak, immediately." Mrs. Garrison, sensing drama, suddenly remembered urgent business in the storeroom. Beatrice faced her mother alone, her stomach knotting with familiar anxiety. "Mother, what have you done?" Eleanor hissed, glancing around to ensure they were unobserved. "Everyone in town is talking about you and that mountain man. They're saying you're married. Married. Without informing your family, without a proper ceremony, without any consideration for how this reflects on us." "It's not," Beatrice began, but her mother steamrolled forward. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Your father and I had to hear about our daughter's supposed wedding from Mayor Hutchinson. The mayor. And now people are asking us about grandchildren, about when we'll meet our son-in-law, about why we weren't at the wedding." "There was no wedding," Beatrice finally managed to interject. "Mother, it was a misunderstanding. Joshua and I aren't married. We were just—" "Not married?" Eleanor's face flushed deeper. "So you were play acting, pretending to be married? That's even worse. Do you understand what people will think? That you're trying to trap him? That you're so desperate for a husband, you'll claim one falsely?" Each word landed like a blow, but Beatrice forced herself to stand straight to meet her mother's eyes. Let them think what they want. "Joshua and I shared a table and a few dances. If Riverside chose to interpret that as marriage, that's their mistake, not ours." "Don't be naive," Eleanor snapped. "Reputation matters, especially for a girl in your situation. You can't afford to give people reasons to talk about you more than they already do." "My situation?" Beatrice repeated, something breaking loose inside her. "You mean being fat? Being unmarriageable? Being such an embarrassment that my own parents won't attend community events if I'm there?" Eleanor's face paled. "That's not—" "It is," Beatrice said quietly. "It's exactly what you mean, and you're right. People do talk about me. They talk about how strange it is that I exist, how unfortunate it is that I refuse to hide away, how uncomfortable my presence makes them feel. Last night, for a few hours, they talked about something different. They talked about me dancing, about me being someone's choice, about me being part of the celebration rather than its embarrassing footnote." Tears threatened, but Beatrice refused to let them fall. Was it based on a lie? Yes. Was it worth it anyway? Also yes, because for those few hours I remembered what it felt like to matter, to be seen as something other than a burden or a joke or a charitable obligation. And I won't apologize for that, not even to you. Eleanor stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she gathered herself. "You're being hysterical. When you've calmed down and realized the damage you've done to your prospects." "What prospects?" Beatrice asked simply. "Be honest, Mother. What prospects do I have that this could possibly damage? I'm 24, unmarried and working in a store. There are no marriage offers waiting in the wings. There's no respectable future being jeopardized. There's just this. This life, this town, these people who have already decided what I'm worth." She took a shaky breath. "Joshua Crawford saw something different in me, even if only for an evening. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was kindness, maybe it was just boredom. But he looked at me like I was a person worth knowing. When was the last time you looked at me like that?" The question hung between them like a blade. Eleanor's face worked through several emotions, anger, hurt, guilt, before settling into a stiff mask of wounded dignity. "I see I've wasted my time coming here," she said coldly. "When you're ready to discuss this rationally, you know where to find me." She swept out, leaving Beatrice trembling in the empty store. Mrs. Garrison emerged from the storeroom, her expression caught between sympathy and acute discomfort. "Perhaps you should take the rest of the day off," she suggested gently. "I can manage the store alone." Ooh. Beatrice nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled upstairs to her room. Beatrice spent the afternoon crying, not from sadness exactly, but from a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, at finally speaking truths that had festered for years, grief for the relationship with her mother that had never been what she needed, shame at her own deception, and underneath it all, a strange, desperate hope connected to a man she barely knew. Evening shadows were creeping across her room when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, unfamiliar footsteps. A knock sounded at her door. "Beatrice, it's Joshua. Mrs. Garrison said you were unwell. May I come in?" Beatrice scrambled upright, hastily wiping her eyes and smoothing her hair. Just a moment." She opened the door to find Joshua standing in the narrow hallway, his face creased with concern. He held a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "I brought you something," he said, offering the package. "Thought you might not have eaten." Inside was fresh bread, cheese, and a small pot of honey. Simple fare, but chosen with care. Despite everything, Beatrice felt a smile tug at her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's kind of you." "May I?" Joshua gestured to the doorway. Propriety dictated she should refuse. An unmarried woman allowing a man into her private room was scandalous, but after everything that had happened, propriety seemed laughably irrelevant. "Please," she said, stepping back to let him enter. Joshua moved into the small space, which suddenly felt much smaller with his presence filling it. He looked around, taking in the sparse furnishings, the single window overlooking the street, the neat but worn appearance of everything. "Mrs. Garrison told me about your mother's visit," he said quietly. "And apparently half the town has been interrogating you about our supposed marriage. This is my fault. I should have anticipated how people would react, should have considered the consequences for you." "You gave me a choice," Beatrice reminded him. "I chose to participate in the pretense. Whatever consequences followed are as much my responsibility as yours." Joshua shook his head. "You chose to help what you thought was a stranger in an awkward situation. You didn't sign up for the entire town dissecting your life and relationships." He moved to the window, looking out at the bustling trading fair below. "I should tell you something else, something I haven't been entirely honest about." Beatrice's heart sank. Of course there was more. "What is it?" "When I said Constance Whitmore wasn't really pursuing me, that was true," Joshua began. "But I wasn't being completely honest about my motivations for approaching you last night." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I didn't just walk into that hall and randomly notice you sitting alone. I came to Riverside specifically looking for you." Beatrice stared at him, confused. "What? How would you even know who I was?" "Because I've been to Riverside before," Joshua said. 3 years ago, during my first season trapping in these mountains. I came down to trade my furs, and there was a harvest feast that year, too." Memory stirred in Beatrice's mind. 3 years ago, her first time attending the feast alone, when the humiliation was still raw and painful. "I saw you that night," Joshua continued softly, "sitting alone at the same table, in the same corner. You were wearing a green dress and you kept your eyes down the entire evening, like you were trying to make yourself invisible. I almost approached you then, but," he shrugged helplessly. "I was younger, more uncertain. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I left the next morning and headed back to the mountains." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I thought about you. During the long winter, during the solitary months in my cabin, I kept seeing your face, the loneliness in it, the determination not to let that loneliness break you. I told myself I was being foolish, building fantasies about a woman I'd never spoken to. But when spring came and I started trapping again, I found myself working my way back toward Riverside." "You came back? For me?" Beatrice whispered, almost afraid to believe it. "I came back to see if you were real," Joshua admitted. to see if the woman I remembered was as strong and kind as I'd imagined, or if I'd built you into something you weren't. When I arrived in town and asked around, carefully, casually, I learned you were still here, still working at the general store, still attending community events alone. He reached out, taking her hand gently. So yes, I walked into that feast last night looking for you specifically. The pretense about Constance was an excuse to talk to you, to sit with you, to see if the reality matched my memory. And Beatrice, his voice roughened with emotion. The reality was so much better than memory. You're funnier than I imagined, kinder than I hoped, and stronger than I possibly could have guessed. Beatrice pulled her hand back, her mind reeling. This doesn't make sense. You spent 3 years thinking about someone you'd seen once from across a room? That's not... People don't do that. Lonely people do, Joshua said simply. People who recognize something essential in another person, even from a distance. I'm not saying I fell in love with you 3 years ago. How could I? I didn't know you. But I recognized something familiar in you, something that resonated with my own experience. And I couldn't forget it. He sat down heavily on the room's single chair, suddenly looking exhausted. Maybe I am a fool. Maybe I built this entire fantasy around a stranger and came hundreds of miles based on nothing but a feeling. But I needed to know, Beatrice. I needed to know if you were still here, still surviving, still fighting to exist in a world that wanted you to disappear. Why? Beatrice demanded, her voice rising with confusion and something dangerously close to hope. Why would that matter to you? You don't know me. You don't know anything about me beyond one evening of observation and one night of dancing. Because I know what it's like. Joshua's voice rose to match hers. I know what it's like to be dismissed, to be judged unworthy, to have your existence treated as an inconvenience by people who should care about you. He stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. My father was a prominent merchant in Philadelphia, respectable, wealthy, well-connected. He had plans for me, university, law practice, marriage to a suitable girl from a suitable family, but I didn't fit his vision. I wasn't interested in law or society or any of the things he valued. I wanted wilderness, adventure, freedom. When I told him I was going west to trap, he disowned me, Joshua continued, his voice raw with old pain. Said I was throwing away every advantage, embarrassing the family, choosing a life beneath my station. My mother cried. My siblings stopped speaking to me. And you know what hurt most? Not their disapproval of my choices, but their absolute certainty that I was somehow less because I wanted something different than they did. He stopped pacing, facing Beatrice directly. So when I saw you 3 years ago, sitting alone in that feast hall, I recognized that look on your face, the look of someone being told they're not good enough, not acceptable, not deserving of basic human connection, and refusing to believe it, refusing to hide away even though staying visible hurts. Tears streamed freely down Beatrice's face now. That doesn't explain why you came back, why you care what happens to someone you don't know. Because someone should care, Joshua said, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Because you deserve to have someone look at you and see all the things you are instead of all the things you're not. Because 3 years ago, I failed you by walking away, and I wanted a chance to not fail you again. He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And because somewhere in those 3 years of thinking about you, of imagining conversations we might have, of wondering who you really were beneath that mask of determined survival, somewhere in all that, my feelings became more than simple recognition. They became genuine caring. For you. For the real you I wanted desperately to know. Beatrice couldn't speak. Everything she thought she understood about the previous night had shifted, revealing new depths and meanings she wasn't sure how to process. Joshua wasn't a stranger moved by momentary kindness. He was a man who had carried her memory for 3 years, who had traveled hundreds of miles on the possibility of connection. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. It was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "You don't have to say anything," Joshua replied gently. "I know this is a lot. I've had 3 years to think about this. You've had 3 minutes. I couldn't keep lying to you, even by omission. You deserve honesty, even if it's complicated and overwhelming." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm leaving Riverside in 5 days. I need to reach my winter cabin before the snow closes the passes. But if you're willing, I'd like to spend those 5 days getting to know the real you, not the pretend marriage version. No deceptions, no performances, just us." Whatever that might mean, Beatrice wiped her eyes, trying to think clearly through the chaos of emotions flooding her. "And after 5 days, when you leave for the mountains?" Joshua's expression turned sorrowful. "I don't know. I have no right to ask you to wait for me, to trust in feelings that are barely formed. But I also can't pretend I don't want more time, more chances, more conversations. So I guess I'm asking if you'd be willing to try, knowing there are no guarantees and a lot of uncertainty." It was madness. 5 days couldn't possibly be enough time to build something real. And yet, looking at Joshua's earnest face, remembering the feeling of dancing with him, of being seen by him, Beatrice found herself nodding. "Yes," she said. "Let's try." The next 5 days unfolded like a dream Beatrice was afraid to examine too closely, lest it dissolve into morning light. Joshua called for her early the next morning, asking Mrs. Garrison's permission to take Beatrice to the trading fair. The older woman had given them a knowing look but agreed, probably recognizing that denial would only fuel more gossip. They walked through the bustling marketplace together, and it was nothing like the harvest feast. No pretense, no performance. Just 2 people talking, learning each other's stories. Joshua told her about his childhood in Philadelphia, about the suffocating expectations that drove him west. Beatrice shared her own history, the gradual realization that she didn't meet Riverside's standards of acceptable femininity, the slow withdrawal of her family's affection, the development of her armor of determined independence. "Don't you ever want to leave?" Joshua asked as they examined a trader's display of Native American beadwork. "Head west to somewhere new, somewhere people don't have preset ideas about who you are?" "Every day," Beatrice admitted, "but leaving requires money I don't have, courage I'm not sure I possess, and somewhere to go. I can't just walk into the wilderness and expect to survive like you can." "You could learn," Joshua said thoughtfully. "Mountain living isn't as impossible as people think. It requires different skills than town living, but they can be taught." The second day, Joshua took Beatrice outside town to a meadow he'd discovered, where autumn wildflowers still bloomed despite the cooling temperatures. They sat in the grass, and Joshua taught her to identify animal tracks, to read weather signs in the sky, to understand the language of the wilderness he loved so well. "This is who you really are," Beatrice observed, watching him point out a hawk riding the thermals. Not the polite man at the harvest feast, but this, someone completely at home in wild places. "Both are real," Joshua countered. "I can be civilized when needed. But yes, this feels more natural. Does that bother you?" "No," Beatrice said honestly. "It's refreshing, actually. You're not pretending to be something you're not to meet society's expectations." Joshua smiled. Rich, coming from someone who's been pretending to be unaffected by society's judgment for years. "Touché," Beatrice acknowledged with a rueful laugh. The third day brought complications. Eleanor Thornton encountered them walking together on Main Street and created a scene, demanding to know Joshua's intentions and accusing him of trifling with her daughter's affections. Joshua, to his credit, responded with perfect courtesy. "Mrs. Thornton, I assure you my intentions toward your daughter are entirely honorable. I'm courting her properly with the hope that she might consent to become my wife. Truly, this time." The statement caused such a stir that Mayor Hutchinson got involved, asking pointed questions about Joshua's prospects, his ability to provide, his background. Joshua answered everything honestly. Yes, he was the disowned son of a Philadelphia merchant family. Yes, he made his living trapping. Yes, it was an uncertain life. But he'd survived 7 years and accumulated modest savings. And yes, he fully understood the responsibility of taking a wife into the wilderness. By evening, all of Riverside was debating whether Beatrice Thornton was finally achieving respectable marriage or making a terrible mistake. "I'm sorry," Joshua said as they escaped to the meadow again, seeking privacy. "I didn't mean to announce our courtship so publicly, but your mother was asking questions I didn't want to dodge." "It's all right," Beatrice assured him, "though it does raise a question. Were you serious? About wanting to marry me?" Joshua took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "I meant every word. I know it's fast, probably too fast, but I've learned that life in the wilderness doesn't allow for long, leisurely courtships. You make decisions quickly and commit to them fully, because hesitation can be fatal." He met her eyes squarely. "I want you to be my wife, Beatrice, not a pretend one, but real and permanent. I want to wake up to your face every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to teach you the mountains and learn your thoughts. I want to build a life that makes room for both of us exactly as we are." "That's terrifying," Beatrice whispered. "I know," Joshua agreed, "for both of us. But is it a good terrifying or a bad terrifying?" Beatrice considered, examining her feelings honestly. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely. But underneath it all, a growing certainty that this strange, intense connection was something rare and worth pursuing. Good terrifying, she decided. Definitely good terrifying. The 4th day, they made plans. Joshua showed her maps of his territory, explaining where his cabin was located, what the journey would entail, what she would need to learn and bring. Beatrice proved a quick study, asking intelligent questions about food storage, clothing requirements, and what tasks would be necessary for survival. "You're taking this seriously," Joshua observed with approval. "Of course I am," Beatrice replied. "If I'm going to do this, and I think I am, I'm going to do it properly. I refuse to be a burden who can't contribute." That evening, Joshua brought her to meet with Mrs. Sarah Whitford, a widow who had lived in the mountains with her trapper husband for 15 years before he died. Sarah spent hours talking with Beatrice, sharing practical advice about wilderness living, warning about challenges, but also speaking eloquently about the freedom and beauty of mountain life. "It's hard," Sarah admitted, "harder than anything you've experienced in town. But if you have someone good beside you, someone who respects your partnership, it can also be extraordinary. You'll be cold sometimes, hungry occasionally, lonely when he's out checking trap lines, but you'll also be free in ways women in town can never be. Free from judgment, from gossip, from constantly measuring yourself against standards you'll never meet." She studied Beatrice carefully. "Joshua Crawford is a good man, one of the best I've known. He'll work hard to provide for you. He'll listen to your thoughts, and he'll value your contributions. That's rarer than you might think. The question,